Welcome to this new automotive news video for Tuesday, April 28, 2026. Today we're going to talk about Fiat, where sales of the 500 hybrid, which was rushed to market a few months ago in an attempt to save the current generation of the 500, are actually doing much worse than expected. We'll also talk quite a bit about Chinese brands, with some pretty funny anecdotes, as you'll see, especially about Chery, the Chinese group that wants to launch 3 more brands in Europe. We'll also talk about Great Wall Motor, which wants to launch an off-road style 4x4 in Europe. That's half the price of what the competition offers. But also some good news from certain traditional brands like Nissan, which had a good start to 2026 and is finally showing positive numbers. Also from Mercedes, which is sharing interesting details about future SL engines. I hope these topics will interest you. If that's the case, I'm counting on you to show it, as usual, by leaving a like on this video, subscribing for the next ones, boosting this one if that option's available to you, and of course by leaving a comment where you share your opinion about today's news. As I was saying, we're going to start by talking a little bit about Fiat, which is once again facing some commercial difficulties with its Fiat 500 hybrid. Indeed, the current generation of the basic Fiat 500 was only sold as an electric vehicle. And even though sales weren't bad at first, with about 45 to 50,000 units per year between 2020 and 2023, these sales volumes are actually much lower and far from what the previous gasoline-powered 500 used to achieve, which sold 3 to 4 times better. That was the peak, if I'm not mistaken. That must have been in 2017 when 189,000 units were sold. So not only does the electric version sell less, but on top of that, sales dropped quickly. Starting in 2024, it's 30 to 40,000 units per year, whereas the previous one sold steadily between 2007 and 2019, a 12-year run. These poor sales of the electric version were quite a problem for Fiat to manage because almost the entire Fiat lineup was centered around the Fiat 500. That is to say, very clearly, their best-selling model was starting to falter. This had immediate repercussions on the industrial side, since the Mirafiori factory where this car was produced was regularly put on hold because of too few orders. And by the way, remember, that was the very first topic of my very first news video on YouTube. The big problem with the Fiat 500, and the reason why it's absolutely impossible for sales to suddenly pick up again, is that technically it's obsolete. The largest version has a range of 330 kilometers sold at the unreasonable price of 27,400 euros. In the early 2020s, the electric car was more or less acceptable, but a few years later, it became completely outclassed compared to the competition. And since the 500 is a very small vehicle with a tiny chassis that leaves very little room for technology, it's impossible to boost it by putting in bigger batteries. As a result, the only thing Fiat managed to cobble together to try to save sales was to offer a hybrid version. A hybrid version with a small 3-cylinder gasoline engine with 60 horsepower, on which all hopes have been pinned while waiting for the arrival of the next generation of the Fiat 500, which should indeed offer somewhat more modern technologies. This strategy worked a little, since at the beginning of the year, the Mirafiori factory, which also produces this hybrid 500, recorded a notable increase in its production, up 42%, with 14,000 Fiat 500S assembled, all engine types combined, hybrid plus electric. That's good. It sends a positive signal, but it's still very far from the sales targets. If commercial performance holds up, Mirafiori should produce about 60,000 of them this year. That would already be pretty good, but Fiat's original goal was 120,000 per year, which is twice as much. So for now, the Fiat 500 is still selling at half the rate that was hoped for with the arrival of this new hybrid version. It's probably because its entry-level price remains quite high. We're talking about 18,000 euros for a very small car whose entire driving character, fun, and even sporty in some cases, has disappeared. When Fiat gave it only one gasoline engine option, a 70-horsepower 3-cylinder, it takes a long and painful 17 seconds to go from 0 to 100 kilometers per hour. Salvation might come from Chinese brands, which will become more and more numerous in Europe. That's what the Chery Group claims, which already sells 2 brands in Europe, Geeko and Omoda, and wants to increase to 4 brands by 2027, and to 5 or maybe even 6 by 2030. That's 4 more brands. The first will be Le Pas, a brand dedicated to premium SUVs, as if the European market needed more premium SUVs. The second is the Freelander brand, which was co-founded in partnership with Jaguar Land Rover, and yesterday unveiled its first vehicle, the Freelander 8. The third brand's name is still unknown, but we know Chery plans to make it the Chinese Dacia. Where it gets interesting is that it was specified that they're targeting the old Dacia, not the current Dacia. That means vehicles that are maybe simpler, more economical, with fewer options. And then there's the iCore brand, about which there's a great story that I'll tell you in a moment. But first, let me point out that iQor mainly sells 4x4s and SUVs inspired by what Land Rover offers, even though at the time it had no connection with the JLR group. What's pretty funny, and the little anecdote I find quite interesting, is that the brand is called iQor, but not everywhere. In fact, in China, the brand is called iCar. That must be the original name. Except that in the 2000s and 2010s, Apple, the phone manufacturer, registered the names for a whole bunch of products that start with I. The iPhone, the iPad, the iWatch, and even the iCar, back when Apple still had automotive projects. This name was registered all over the world except in China. In fact, in China, this brand is sold under the name iCar. In Europe, they're not allowed to do that because Apple registered the name, which is why the brand simply added a U to its name, turning iCar into iCor. It's not the only Chinese brand that's going to arrive in Europe. Really, there's going to be a flood of them in the coming months. There's also Gritwold Motor, which I've mentioned before since they plan to launch a city car in Europe. Now they're discussing an off-road 4x4 inspired by other models. Maybe a little less like the Land Rover Defender, but maybe a bit more like Japanese off-road vehicles, such as the Land Cruiser from Toyota. It's called the Gritwold H7. It's a hybrid 4x4, which will soon be available on the European market with two different engine options. The first one is a non-plug-in hybrid powertrain, based on a 1.5-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder gasoline engine. It's true this sounds like heresy for a vehicle that's usually more comfortable with diesel. In this version, it delivers 220 horsepower for 2.3 tons, so it's not sporty at all, despite having quite a lot of power. And keep in mind that it will later be joined by another plug-in hybrid version, based on the same engine but assisted by a larger electric motor, which should develop 450 horsepower. What's quite interesting, and where there's really some news, is that Gritwold Motor announces that this vehicle will be sold in Europe starting at 35,000 euros, which is the price of a fully equipped Dacia Bigster. Remember, a fully loaded Dacia's engine only produces 140 horsepower. So it's true that in terms of technology, the H7 seems much more interesting, especially since it's targeting not the Dacia, but rather the Land Cruiser, by offering a whole range of options and comfort features that the Bigster doesn't have, as well as driving equipment, especially for off-roading, like a differential lock system and 7 different off-road driving modes, a snow mode, a sand mode, a gravel mode, and a real 4-wheel drive system, which the Bigster also doesn't have. So here, Gritwold Motor is really playing in the field of real off-road vehicles, and it's true that at this price, there's not much that's truly comparable in Europe, since we should remember that to get a Toyota Land Cruiser, a real one, you have to pay close to 80,000 to 120,000 euros before the emissions surcharge. It's half the price, but will it be half as reliable? We'll likely find out in the coming months. As I said at the start of this video, let's end with 2 pieces of good news. The first is about Nissan. Nissan, which still has a particularly complicated financial situation, but has actually had a rather good start to the year 2026. Nissan expected to finish the current fiscal year, which will actually end in May 2026, with a loss of around 310 million euros. Now, it estimates that it will be in the black, with a profit of more than 350 million euros. Well, after that, we have to look at the sacrifices that were made to get there. Because let's remember that Nissan developed a particularly far-reaching austerity plan, with layoffs all over the world, factory closures, and project abandonments. But it also benefited, especially in the American market, still one of its largest, from the improved situation. For example, regarding the American rules on CO2 emissions, as a result, compliance and certification costs are lower, and Nissan managed to make a higher profit margin than expected. So, that's good news. But Nissan's financial health remains quite fragile. And above all here, we might wonder if it's not just a stroke of luck. Because it's not really an improvement due to the arrival of a new bestseller that would have made incredible sales. It's just small things here and there. A series of lucky breaks that allowed Nissan to make some profits. We'll see. Another piece of good news to finish, this time coming from Mercedes, which continues to offer sporty combustion engine cars in its lineup. So, remember, we talked about the SL a few weeks ago in a video when we learned that Mercedes was discontinuing the 4-cylinder engine in the 43 AMG versions for reasons of CO2 emissions, but also because of the noise, which was too loud given the new European standards on the sound of combustion engine cars. We mentioned that the entry-level model would no longer be the SL43, but actually the SL53, which will benefit from a new 3-liter 6-cylinder engine, a gasoline engine certified for future Euro standards and for noise regulations. And it has just been confirmed that there will indeed be SL55 and SL63 versions, which will be based on 4-liter twin-turbo V8 engines. The SL55 should develop around 540 horsepower and the SL63 around 650, with an engine that has been specially reworked to meet emission standards, but also to comply with noise regulations, which may seem a bit paradoxical, but actually, The Mercedes AMG four-cylinder was so loud that it was much noisier than a big V8 engine. That's a wrap on a busy Tuesday in car news with both good and bad updates. Share your thoughts in the comments. In any case, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, don't hesitate to show it by leaving a like, subscribing, and becoming a supporter by clicking the join button. I'll see you tomorrow for the next video. Bye!